Although she was branded a moral leper, a mob associate, and a threat to decency by the very society that secretly desire after her, she was hunted by the FBI, betrayed by the justice system, and ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison, a punishment far worse than that given to the rapists and murderers of her time. Her name was Candy Barr. How did a woman whose only weapon was her raw allure become a target that the state of Texas was determined to destroy? That shattering was inevitable. Juanita Slusher was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled: the suffocating poverty she was born into and the predatory glamour she was forced to join. Her story begins not in the glamour of a nightclub, but in the suffocating heat of Edna, Texas. Born on July 6, 1935, Juanita entered a world that was still reeling from the economic devastation of the Great Depression. Edna was a small town, the kind of place where the church steeple was the highest point on the horizon, and the social hierarchy was carved in stone. It was a world of dust and oil where men worked themselves to the bone and women were expected to be silent pillars of the household, unseen, unheard, and obedient. The Texas of the late 1930s and early 1940s was a harsh environment for a child, particularly one born into a family fracturing under the weight of poverty. The Slusher family was large, struggling to make ends meet, but they had a linchpin, Juanita's mother, Eloda. In the psychological landscape of a young child, the mother is the barrier between the self and the chaos of the world. For Juanita, Eloda was the only source of softness in a hard life. But in 1944, when Juanita was just 9 years old, the hinge of fate swung violently. Eloda Slusher was killed in a horrific automobile accident. The details of the crash are less important than the vacuum it created. The death of a mother in such a time and place was a catastrophic event for a young girl. It was the moment the shield was removed. Juanita's father, overwhelmed by grief and the burden of raising a large family alone, was ill-equipped to handle a spirited, heartbroken daughter. He worked long hours, and the supervision of the children fell to relatives and neighbors. It is here, in the shadows of a grieving household, that the true tragedy began. The historical record, corroborated by Candy's later accounts and psychological profiles, points to a period of intense vulnerability. Without her mother's protection, 9-year-old Juanita became a target. She was subjected to unspeakable abuse by a neighbor, a betrayal of trust that shattered her understanding of safety. In the 1940s, such things were rarely spoken of. They were buried under the heavy silence of shame. There was no therapy, no intervention, no Department of Child Services to swoop in. There was only a confused little girl who learned a terrifying lesson. Her body was not her own, and the adults charged with protecting her were either predators or oblivious. This trauma is the key to unlocking everything that followed. The psychological scars formed in Edna created a desperate need for two things: escape and protection. Juanita began to view the world as a place of threats, and she realized early on that she had to grow up fast if she wanted to survive. By the time she hit puberty, she looked years older than her age, a curse that would facilitate her entry into the adult world far too soon. The quiet, dusty streets of Edna began to feel like a prison cell. She knew that if she stayed, she would suffocate. She would become just another worn-down woman in a town that didn't care. In 1948, at the tender age of 13, Juanita Slusher stopped being a child. Driven by a cocktail of fear, trauma, and a desperate desire for autonomy, she ran away. She didn't just run to a neighbor's house, she ran to Dallas. To a 13-year-old girl from a rural town, post-war Dallas must have looked like a different planet. It was a booming metropolis, awash in oil money and ambition. The skyline was rising. The streets were choked with Cadillacs and Packards, and the air smelled of gasoline and opportunity. But Dallas had a dark underbelly. It was a city of stark duality. By day, it was the buckle of the Bible Belt, a fortress of Southern Baptist morality where alcohol was frowned upon and church attendance was mandatory. By night, however, it was a wide-open town. Corruption was endemic in the police force. Gambling dens operated behind thin facades, and the vice trade flourished in the cheap motels and honky-tonks on the city's fringe. Juanita arrived in this chaotic ecosystem with nothing. She had no money, no connections, and no skills other than a fierce will to survive. Because she had developed early physically, she was able to pass for 18. This ability to deceive was her only asset, but it was a double-edged sword. It allowed her to get jobs, but it also exposed her to adult dangers she was mentally unprepared to handle. She found work initially as a waitress, navigating the diner culture of the city. But the wages of a waitress in 1949 were barely enough to keep a roof over one's head. She was living in a precarious state of existence, often one missed paycheck away from homelessness. It was in this vulnerable state that she met the kind of men who prey on runaways. They were smooth-talking, dangerous men who recognized the look in her eyes, that specific mixture of hunger and fear. Among the first of these figures was a man named Billy Joe Debs. He wasn't a tycoon or a movie star, he was a safecracker. To a 14-year-old Juanita, however, he represented something she hadn't felt since her mother died: security. He was tough, he was street smart, and he offered her a place to belong. In a decision that highlights her desperation, she married him. She was a 14-year-old bride to a career criminal. The marriage was a disaster of instability. Instead of finding safety, she was thrust deeper into the criminal underworld. She was no longer just a runaway. She was now an accessory to the chaotic life of a thief. It was during these teenage years, that should have been spent in high school classrooms, that Juanita was forced into the darkest corners of survival. There are gaps in the record here, silences that speak volumes. We know she engaged in the sex trade, not out of glamour or desire, but out of the sheer, brutal necessity of eating. She was a child of the sex trade in a city that consumed girls like her by the dozen. The turning point, the moment Juanita began to die and Candy began to live, came when she stumbled into the world of burlesque. In the early 1950s, burlesque was evolving. It was moving away from the vaudeville comedy acts of the past and toward a more focused display of female sensuality. It was still considered low-brow entertainment, frowned upon by polite society, but it was a booming business. The clubs in Dallas, particularly around the Commerce Street area, were packed every night with businessmen, oil workers, and travelers. Juanita landed a job at the Theater Lounge and later the Colony Club. The Colony Club was the premier night spot in Dallas, run by a man named Barney Weinstein. Weinstein was a seasoned operator in the nightlife business, and he had an eye for talent. When he looked at the teenage Juanita Slusher, he didn't see a battered runaway. He saw electricity. He saw a natural, raw charisma that couldn't be taught. She had a face that was almost angelic, contrasting sharply with a body that was undeniably physical allure. Weinstein knew that Juanita Slusher was not a name that would light up a marquee. It sounded too rural, too plain. Legend has it that the new name came from her sweet tooth. She was constantly eating Snickers bars and chocolates to keep her energy up. Weinstein reportedly told her, "You're sweet like candy." And thus, the first half of the persona was born. The bar was added for punch, for rhythm. Candy Barr. It sounded tough, yet inviting. It was a name you could whisper or a name you could shout. But a name wasn't enough. In the crowded market of strippers, one needed a gimmick. Most dancers of the era relied on feathers, fans, and faux European sophistication. They pretended to be French maids or exotic queens. Candy Barr went in the opposite direction. She looked at her roots, at the Texas soil she came from, and she decided to embody the ultimate local fantasy. She became the cowgirl. She bleached her hair to a blinding platinum blonde, a stark contrast to the dark, smoky interiors of the clubs. She donned a white Stetson hat, tilted rakishly over one eye. She wore white leather cowboy boots with tassels, and, most iconically, she strapped a holster around her waist, containing a pearl-handled revolver. When she stepped onto the stage, she wasn't submitting to the audience, she was holding them up. The transformation was psychological as much as it was physical. When Juanita put on the boots and the gun, she wasn't the victim anymore. The gun, even if it was a prop, was a symbol of power. The act was a reclamation. She would strut across the stage to the bluesy, grinding rhythm of the saxophone, her eyes locking with the men in the front row, challenging them. She took the quintessential symbol of Texas masculinity, the cowboy, and feminized it, weaponized it, and served it back to the patriarchy on a silver platter. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dallas had never seen anything like her. She wasn't just taking her clothes off. She was performing a character that resonated deep in the Texan psyche. She was the outlaw queen. By her late teens, she was no longer scraping by on waitress tips. She was commanding huge sums of money. The girl who had run away with nothing was now driving a Cadillac, wearing furs, and holding court at the Colony Club like royalty. But as Candy Barr's star began to rise, illuminating the Dallas skyline, it attracted the attention of forces far more dangerous than safecrackers. She had found a way to escape poverty, but she had walked directly into the spotlight of the mafia, the corrupt police, and a moral crusader class that was sharpening its knives, waiting for the perfect victim to sacrifice. By 1955, Candy Barr was no longer just a dancer. She was a Dallas institution. She was earning more money in a week than the average Texas father earned in 6 months. But in the underworld, success is never a solitary endeavor. To rise that high, you need patrons, and the patrons Candy Barr attracted were men who carried the scent of violence like a cheap cologne. Enter Jack Ruby. History remembers Jack Ruby as the erratic, trembling man in the fedora who stepped out of a crowd in 1963 to silence Lee Harvey Oswald. But in the mid-50s, Ruby was the chaotic impresario of Dallas nightlife. He owned the Carousel Club and the Vegas Club, and he was a fixture in Candy's life. Ruby was a complex figure, a man desperate for respect, desperate to be a big shot. He managed Candy for a time, acting as a gatekeeper to her stardom. Those who knew them described a volatile relationship. Ruby was protective, treating her like a prize racehorse, but he was also deeply exploitative. He saw in Candy's platinum shine a reflection of the success he craved, but could never quite grasp on his own. He physically assaulted her on more than one occasion, a testament to the brutal misogyny that underpinned their professional arrangement. Yet strangely, he remained in her orbit, a small angry moon circling a bright planet. But Jack Ruby was small time. The man who truly altered the trajectory of Candy's life and ultimately sealed her fate was Mickey Cohen. If Ruby was a hustler, Mickey Cohen was a king. Based in Los Angeles, Cohen was the heir to Bugsy Siegel's empire, a mob boss who operated with the flair of a movie star. He didn't hide in the shadows. He held press conferences. He was friends with Frank Sinatra and enemies with the Attorney General. When Cohen met Candy Barr, the attraction was nuclear. Their relationship bridged the gap between the Texas underworld and the Hollywood mafia. Cohen flew Candy to Los Angeles, parading her through the finest restaurants on the Sunset Strip. For a girl who had grown up in the dust of Edna, Texas, this was a seduction of the highest order. Cohen didn't just offer jewelry and furs, he offered a terrifying kind of safety. In his presence, the local creeps and abusive ex-husbands of Dallas vanished. Who would dare touch the girlfriend of Mickey Cohen? But this protection was an illusion. By associating with Cohen, Candy painted a target on her back that was visible from Washington, D.C. The FBI and the Los Angeles Police Department were obsessed with bringing Cohen down. They tapped his phones, they followed his cars, and they scrutinized everyone in his circle. When Candy Barr entered that circle, she ceased to be a local vice problem for the Dallas police. She became a person of interest in a federal crusade against organized crime. She was living a double life. In Dallas, she was the cowgirl queen, the darling of the oil tycoons. In Los Angeles, she was the mobsters' moll, a woman whispering secrets in the ear of public enemy number one. It was a high-wire act performed without a net, and she was beginning to wobble. While the police watched her because of Mickey Cohen, the public watched her for a darker, more prurient reason. A ghost from her teenage years had returned to haunt her, captured on a reel of grainy 16mm film. The film was titled Smart Alec. Filmed around 1951, when Candy was barely 16 years old, it is cited by historians as one of the first adult films to achieve widespread underground distribution in America. The backstory of this footage is a tragic echo of her childhood vulnerability. Candy consistently maintained that she was coerced into making it, drugged or threatened by men who saw a runaway girl as a disposable commodity. In the 1950s, the concept of non-consensual explicit material, or coerced pornography, did not legally exist. If you were in the film, you were guilty of the obscenity. The film became a viral phenomenon long before the internet existed. It was duplicated and sold in fraternity houses, secret smokers, and private parties from coast to coast. It was the black market tape that everyone whispered about. For Candy, it was a nightmare that refused to end. No matter how much legitimate success she achieved, no matter that she was starring in mainstream theater productions like Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, or being considered for Hollywood roles, Smart Alec was always there, dragging her back into the gutter. The existence of this film did something catastrophic to her legal standing. It stripped her of her victimhood in the eyes of the law. To the police and the judges, a woman who appeared in such a film could not be raped, could not be abused, and certainly could not be innocent. She was branded lewd at a cellular level. It dehumanized her, turning her into an object of public consumption rather than a citizen with rights. This was the paradox of her fame. The men of Dallas lined up around the block to see her strip at the Colony Club, cheering her on. The same men would then go home to their wives and condemn her as a moral stain on the city. She was the vessel into which they poured their desires and their shame. And when the time came to punish someone for the city's sins, she was the perfect scapegoat. By late 1957, the walls were closing in. The Dallas police were under immense pressure. The newspapers were running editorials about the vice and corruption rotting the city's soul. The police chief needed a headline-grabbing arrest to prove he was cleaning up the town. They couldn't catch the big fish, the slippery gamblers, or the politically connected fixers, so they went after the mermaid. The target was Candy Barr, but the goal wasn't just to arrest her, it was to break her. The rumors on the street were that the police wanted Candy to flip. They wanted dirt on Mickey Cohen. They believed that she, as his lover, knew where the bodies were buried, literally and metaphorically. They approached her, pressured her, and threatened her. But Candy Barr possessed a code of honor that was stricter than that of the men carrying badges. She refused to be a snitch. She refused to betray the man who, in her eyes, had treated her with kindness. So, they came for her. On October 27, 1957, a squad of detectives raided her apartment. The official police report reads like a scene from a bad detective novel. They claimed they had received a tip. They burst into her home where she was relaxing. Candy, ever the firebrand, didn't cower. She fought back. She argued. She was a woman who had stared down mobsters. She wasn't going to be intimidated by a few local cops. According to the police, they found a small amount of marijuana. The accounts vary. Some say it was a single joint of cannabis. Others say it was barely enough to fill a thimble. The legend, often repeated, is that she tried to flush it or hide it in her bosom. Candy's version of events was starkly different. She claimed until her dying day that the drugs were planted. She argued that the police brought the marijuana with them, a convenient tool to lock away a woman who knew too much and said too little. Given the rampant corruption of the Dallas police force in the 1950s, a force that was later found to have deep ties to organized crime, her claim carries the heavy weight of plausibility. But the truth of the possession didn't matter. The trap had been sprung. She was arrested, handcuffed, and paraded before the cameras. The flashing bulbs captured her, not as the glamorous star, but as the fallen woman. The headline was ready before the ink was dry. Candy Barr arrested on narcotics charges. The trial that followed in 1958 was a circus. It was the trial of the century for Texas. The courtroom was packed every single day. Men stood on tiptoes in the hallway just to catch a glimpse of her blonde hair. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was poisonous. This was not a trial about a few grams of a plant. It was a heresy trial. The prosecution, led by a zealous district attorney named Henry Wade, did not treat this as a simple possession case. They put Candy's entire life on trial. They paraded her past before the jury. They alluded to the pornographic film. They brought up her failed marriages. They whispered about her black poodle and her white Cadillac as if they were evidence of a pact with the devil. They painted a picture of a woman who was a danger to society, not because she was violent, but because she was uncontrolled. She represented a terrifying freedom that threatened the conservative bedrock of 1950s Texas. If a woman like this could live like a queen, what message did it send to the daughters of the jurors? Candy's defense team fought valiantly, bringing in high-profile lawyers paid for by Mickey Cohen, but they were fighting a losing battle against the zeitgeist. The jury was composed of 12 men who were products of their time. They looked at Candy Barr, and they saw a temptation they had been taught to fear. When the verdict came down, guilty, it was expected. But the sentencing phase was where the true horror lay. In Texas at that time, the jury determined the sentence. The range for marijuana possession was anywhere from a suspended sentence to life imprisonment. It was a law designed to be applied selectively. When the foreman read the sentence, a gasp sucked the air out of the room. 15 years. 15 years in the state penitentiary. To put this in perspective, in the same courthouse that same year, men convicted of manslaughter were receiving sentences of 5 years. Rapists were getting off with probation. A man who shot his wife might serve 3 years, but Candy Barr, for a thimble of illicit substance, 15 years. It was a sentence so disproportionate, so savage, that it made national news. It was a message sent in neon letters. We will destroy you. It wasn't about the drugs, it was a status crime. They were punishing her for being Candy Barr. They were punishing her for Mickey Cohen. They were punishing her for the G-string, the gun, and the audacity to be a woman who didn't know her place. As the bailiffs moved to take her into custody, the glamorous facade finally cracked. The The reality of the cage was descending. The Texas rose had been plucked, and the boot of the state was about to crush her petals into the dirt. But the legal battle was far from over. Candy Barr was a fighter, and she was about to embark on a desperate, years-long war to stay free, a war that would take her to the very steps of the Supreme Court and expose the darkest secrets of the American justice system. The verdict was in, but the cage door had not yet slammed shut. Following her conviction in 1958, Candy Barr entered a strange, purgatorial state of existence. Her lawyers, funded by a rapidly draining reservoir of cash and the waning support of Mickey Cohen, filed an immediate appeal. She was released on bond, a staggering $15,000 bond, an astronomical sum for the time, equivalent to nearly $160,000 today. For the next 2 years, Juanita Slusher lived with a sword of Damocles hanging over her platinum head. This period, often glossed over in summaries of her life, was perhaps the most psychologically torturous. She was free, yet not free. Every morning she woke up wondering if this was the day the marshals would come. Every sunset was a countdown. She tried, with heartbreaking earnestness, to dismantle the persona of Candy Barr and prove to the world that she could be a decent woman. By the standards of 1950s Texas, she stopped stripping. She distanced herself from the nightclubs. She even got married again, this time to a man who seemed to offer a semblance of normalcy. Jack Sahakian, a hairdresser. It was a frantic attempt to camouflage herself in domesticity. She baked, she cleaned, she tended to her animals. She wanted to show the appellate judges that the lewd woman they convicted no longer existed. But the legal system is a machine that runs on paper and money, not sentiment. The cost of her defense was catastrophic. The image of the glamorous mob mall dripping in diamonds was replaced by a woman drowning in legal fees. The financial documents from this era tell a story of desperation, loans, debts, and the liquidation of assets. She was fighting the full weight of the state of Texas, and the state has deeper pockets than any dancer. The bills for transcripts, filings, and retainers piled up, threatening to bankrupt her before she even saw the inside of a cell. She was paying for her freedom by the hour, watching her hard-earned fortune evaporate into the pockets of attorneys who promised miracles they couldn't deliver. Despite her efforts to live quietly, the public refused to let her be. She was a tourist attraction in her own grocery store. People would whisper, point, and stare at the convict buying milk. The isolation was profound. The fair weather friends, the sycophants who had drunk her champagne at the Colony Club, vanished the moment the verdict was read. She was radioactive. The legal battle went all the way to the top. Her attorneys argued that the search of her apartment had been illegal, a violation of the Fourth Amendment. They argued that the sentence was cruel, an unusual punishment. They appealed to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Denied. In a final, desperate Hail Mary, they petitioned the United States Supreme Court. For a brief, shimmering moment, it looked like there might be hope. Justice William O. Douglas, known for his civilitarian leanings, actually heard her bail application. But in the conservative climate of the late 1950s, the highest court in the land was not inclined to expend political capital on a woman with Candy Barr's reputation. In 1959, the Supreme Court refused to hear her case. The legal avenues were exhausted. The game was over. The end came swiftly and without mercy. On a crisp day in late 1959, the FBI didn't just send a letter. They came for her. Because she had traveled with Mickey Cohen during her appeal, they technically revoked her bond on a federal violation regarding crossing state lines. It was a technicality used to ensure she went down. She was arrested at her home. There were no flashing lights this time, no defiant speeches, Just a resigned silence. She packed a small bag. She said goodbye to her poodle. She said goodbye to the little girl inside her who had been running since she was 13. The drive from Dallas to the Gory Unit in Huntsville, Texas, is about 170 miles. It takes roughly 3 hours. One can only imagine the silence in that car. Watching the Texas landscape roll by, the blue bonnets, the oil derricks, the open sky, knowing that for the next 15 years, that sky would be cut into ribbons by iron bars. She was 24 years old. Her life effectively was being paused at its prime. The Gory Unit was the women's wing of the Texas prison system. In the 1950s, it was a hard, unforgiving place. It was a farm unit, meaning inmates were expected to work and work hard. The intake process is designed to strip a human being of their identity. For Candy Barr, this process was a violent dismantling of the myth she had created. First, they took the clothes, the silk, the tailored fabrics. They replaced them with a shapeless, coarse white dress that scratched the skin. Then they took the jewelry, the diamonds Mickey Cohen had given her, the symbols of her worth in the underworld, were cataloged in a manila envelope. Finally, and most brutally, they took the hair. Her platinum blonde hair, her trademark, her crown, the source of her power, was cut off. They scrubbed her face clean of makeup. When she looked in the mirror for the first time as inmate Slusher, Candy Barr was gone. Staring back was Juanita Slusher, pale, frightened, and stripped bare. The prison guards were not kind. To them, she was a celebrity inmate, which meant she had a target on her back. They were determined to prove that she would get no special treatment. If anything, she got it worse. "You think you're a queen?" their attitude said. "Here, you're just another number." She was assigned to the garment factory. The woman whose hands had been insured for thousands of dollars, who had held champagne flutes and pearl-handled revolvers, was now hunched over an industrial sewing machine, stitching uniforms for the state. The heat in the factory was stifling. The noise was deafening. The dust clogged her lungs. This is the part of the story that Hollywood movies usually skip. They show the courtroom drama, then jump to the release. But the reality of prison is the day-to-day grind of years. One would expect a woman like Candy, vain, pampered, used to the high life, to crumble in such an environment. The betting odds were that she would snap, get into fights, or fall into a deep depression. But Juanita surprised everyone. She didn't break. She adapted. Stripped of the male gaze for the first time in her life, she began to explore who she actually was. Without the need to perform, without the need to be sweet like candy, she discovered she had a mind. She became a voracious reader. She read philosophy, history, and literature, and she began to write. In the solitude of her cell, usually after lights out, she wrote poetry. These weren't the scribblings of a dilettante. They were raw, aching verses about loss, regret, and the strange beauty of the world she could no longer touch. One of her poems from this era captures the crushing weight of time. "The days are long, the nights are longer still. I wait for dawn upon the windowsill, to bring the light that shows me where I am, a lost sheep in the valley of the damned." She became a mentor to the younger inmates. Many of the women in Gory were just like she had been, poor, uneducated, abused girls who had made bad choices. Juanita didn't judge them. She taught them how to sew better. She listened to their stories. In the hierarchy of the prison, she earned a respect that had nothing to do with her curves and everything to do with her character. She also faced tragedy inside. While she was locked away, her father passed away. She was denied permission to attend the funeral. It was another blow, another moment where the state asserted its total control over her emotional life. She grieved in her cell, alone, Yet even in prison, her legend grew. Letters poured in from all over the world. Men proposed marriage to her through the mail. Fans sent money. The world hadn't forgotten Candy Barr. If anything, her absence made the obsession grow stronger. She was the Birdman of Alcatraz in a G-string, a mythical figure locked in a tower. But Juanita wasn't interested in the myth anymore. She was interested in survival. She kept her head down, did her time, and prayed that the world outside would change enough to let her back in. By 1963, the winds of change were blowing through Texas. The strict moralism of the 50s was beginning to crack under the pressure of the Kennedy era. The governor of Texas, John Connally, came under pressure to review her case. The consensus was growing that 15 years for a first-time possession charge was not justice. It was vengeance. She had served nearly 3 years of hard time. She had been a model prisoner. On April 1st, 1963, the gates of Gory opened. The woman who walked out was not the same woman who had walked in. She was 27 years old, but her eyes held the weight of a lifetime. Her hair had grown out, but she didn't dye it platinum immediately. She wore a simple dress. The press was there, of course. A swarm of cameras, microphones, and shouting reporters. "Candy, Candy, give us a smile, do a spin." She paused. She looked at them with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. She didn't give them the show they wanted. She simply got into the waiting car and drove away. She was free. But freedom in 1963 came with conditions. Her parole was strict. She was forbidden from working in nightclubs. She was forbidden from associating with known criminals, which effectively cut her off from her entire support network. She couldn't see Mickey Cohen. She couldn't see her old friends. She was released into a Dallas that was vibrating with tension. It was April 1963. In 7 months, President Kennedy would be assassinated in Dealey Plaza, just blocks from where Candy used to strip. Jack Ruby, her old manager, would kill Oswald. The city was a powder keg, and Candy Barr, the fallen angel of Dallas, was trying to find a place to land in a city that was about to explode. She had her freedom, but she had lost her career, her fortune, and her youth. She had to reinvent herself again. But this time, she didn't want to be a star. She just wanted to be safe. Candy Barr had been free for barely 7 months when the world turned upside down. It was November 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. The city was already on edge, a cauldron of political extremism and tension. When the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, killing President John F. Kennedy, the entire nation went into shock. But for Candy Barr, the horror was about to become deeply personal. 2 days later, on November 24th, as the nation watched live on television, a man in a fedora stepped out of the crowd in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters and fired a single fatal shot into the gut of Lee Harvey Oswald. That man was Jack Ruby. To the rest of the world, Ruby was a mystery, a nightclub owner, a patriot, a madman. But to Candy Barr, he was the man who had managed her career, the man who had hit her, the man who had bought her dinner. She knew his temper, his desperation, and his erratic mind better than almost anyone. The moment Ruby pulled the trigger, Candy's hope for a quiet life evaporated. The FBI, the Secret Service, and the Dallas police descended upon anyone who had ever shaken Jack Ruby's hand. Candy wasn't just an acquaintance. In the eyes of the investigators, she was a potential link between the assassin and the organized crime underworld of Mickey Cohen. The interrogation was brutal. Federal agents swarmed her life again. They wanted to know, did Ruby talk to you about the plot? Was this a mob hit? What do you know about Oswald? The tragic irony is that Candy likely knew nothing about the assassination. She had been in prison during the years the conspiracy would have been forming. She was a pariah, not a confidant. But the facts didn't matter. The guilt by association that had sent her to prison in the 50s was now threatening to drag her into the most dangerous murder investigation in American history. She was subjected to intense surveillance. Her phone was tapped. Strange cars parked outside her house. The rumors began to swirl. Conspiracy theories that persist to this day, claiming she was the mob's messenger. For a woman trying to recover from the trauma of incarceration, this renewed pressure was psychologically shattering. She wasn't allowed to heal. She was forced to live in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the government to kick down her door again. As the 1960s wore on, the cultural landscape of America shifted radically. The summer of love, the free love revolution, and the rise of feminism were rewriting the rules of society. In theory, this new world should have embraced Candy Barr. After all, she was a proto-feminist icon, a woman who had been punished for the very freedoms the hippies were now celebrating. But history is rarely that kind. Candy tried to restart her life. She wanted to work. She had dreams of opening a beauty salon, of using her skills to help other women feel glamorous. But the stigma of her conviction was a brand that wouldn't fade. The Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission and the police made it known that any establishment employing Candy Barr would face relentless scrutiny. If she worked at a bar, that bar would lose its liquor license. If she tried to open a business, the permits would get lost. She was effectively blacklisted from making an honest living. This economic strangulation forced her back into the margins, and with the hopelessness came the old demons. The years of abuse, the prison time, and the constant harassment took a toll on her mental health. Like many trauma survivors without access to proper care, she self-medicated. In 1967, and again in the late 60s, she faced new legal troubles. There were arrests for drug possession, pills, marijuana, though many of these charges were dismissed or resulted in minor penalties compared to the 15-year sentence. However, the pattern was clear. The police were not done with her. They would pull her over for minor traffic infractions that turned into vehicle searches. They would raid her home on flimsy tips. It was a campaign of harassment designed to drive her out of town, and it worked. She realized that Candy Barr could not exist in Dallas. The city was too small, the memories too long, and the enemies too powerful. The glittering skyline she had once ruled was now a fortress built to keep her out. In the 1970s, there was one final flickering moment of public visibility. The men's magazine Playboy, the Bible of the free love movement, sought her out. They wanted to interview the legend. The resulting article, published in 1976, is a heartbreaking document. It wasn't a glamorous puff piece. It was an autopsy of a destroyed life. In the interview, Candy spoke with a candor that was decades ahead of her time. She spoke about the hypocrisy of the men who paid to see her exposed and then voted to put her in a cage. She spoke about the Smart Alec film, finally putting on record her assertion that she had been a child, coerced and frightened. She told the interviewer, "I didn't have any morals. I had more morals in my little finger than that whole jury put together." It was a moment of vindication, but it was also a eulogy. The photos accompanying the article showed a woman who was still beautiful, but whose eyes were haunted. She wasn't the fiery cowgirl anymore. She was a survivor surveying the wreckage. The public reaction was mixed. To the new generation, she was a curiosity, a vintage celebrity. To the older generation, she was still the scandalous woman. The interview didn't launch a comeback. It merely served as a bookmark in history, a final for the record, before she faded into the static. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Juanita Slusher made a decision. If the world wouldn't let her be Candy Barr, and it wouldn't let her be a normal citizen, she would remove herself from the world entirely. She left the cities. She moved back towards the rural roots of her childhood, eventually settling in Brownwood and later Victoria, Texas. She bought a modest house. She stopped dyeing her hair platinum. She put away the cowboy boots and the sequins. In their place, she found a new purpose: animals. It is a common psychological trajectory for people who have been deeply hurt by humanity to turn their capacity for love towards creatures that cannot judge them. Juanita became the animal lady of the neighborhood. She took in strays that no one else wanted: dogs with 3 legs, cats that were sick, animals that had been abused and discarded. In these broken creatures, she saw herself. She saw the vulnerability she had felt as a 9-year-old girl in Edna. She saw the abandonment she had felt in the prison cell at Gory. And unlike the people in her life, the father who couldn't protect her, the husband who exploited her, the mobster who used her, the police who hunted her, the animals returned her love unconditionally. She spent her dwindling savings on vet bills. She would fight with neighbors who complained about the noise or the smell. She gained a reputation not as a former blonde bombshell, but as a difficult, eccentric woman. There is a profound sadness in this image. The woman who had once worn furs given to her by Mickey Cohen was now wearing tattered clothes, feeding stray cats on a porch in rural Texas. But there is also a quiet dignity in it. She had created a sanctuary. It was a small, fenced-in world where she was finally the one in control, where she was the protector, not the prey. As the 1990s approached, the physical toll of her life began to manifest. The years of stress, the smoking, the substance use, and the sheer exhaustion of survival caught up with her. She suffered from strokes. Her mobility decreased. The vibrant, athletic dancer who could perform acrobatics on stage was now frail. She lived on a meager income, far removed from the $2,000 a week paychecks of the Colony Club. There were no royalties from her image. The bootleg copies of her films were still being sold, making money for other men, but she saw none of it. The industry she helped build, the billion-dollar adult entertainment complex, had moved on, chewing her up and spitting her out without a pension plan. She became a ghost in her own life. Occasionally, a biographer or a historian would track her down, knocking on her door, hoping for a scoop on Jack Ruby or the mob. Usually she would turn them away. She was tired of talking. She was tired of being a footnote in someone else's history book. She wanted peace. But as she approached the end of the millennium, one final injustice remained. The state of Texas had never apologized. The record still stood. She was still a felon. The woman who had been the victim of a status crime was still branded a criminal by the history books. As the new century dawned, Juanita Slusher prepared for her final act. It would not be on a stage with a spotlight. It would be in a hospital room, quiet and white, far from the neon lights that had burned her so badly. The obituaries that ran in major newspapers, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, were a study in journalistic cognitive dissonance. They couldn't decide how to frame her. Was she a burlesque legend? Was she a mob mall? Was she a convict? Most headlines went with the sensational. Candy Barr, stripper linked to Jack Ruby, dies at 70. Even in death, she was defined by the men she knew and the clothes she took off. The articles retold the salacious details, the marijuana bust, the G-string, the gun. They printed the old photos of her in the cowboy hat. But buried deep in the text of these articles, there was a shift in tone. Journalists who had grown up in the 60s and 70s began to write about her with a retroactive empathy. They noted the harshness of her 15-year sentence. They quoted her poetry. Texas Monthly, the magazine that had chronicled her life better than any other, published a tribute that acknowledged her as a perfect Texan, a figure who embodied the state's mythic blend of independence and tragedy. However, the public reaction was more polarized. On early internet forums and comment sections, the old battles were fought anew. Some users eulogized her as a victim of a puritanical society, a martyr for personal liberation. Others, clinging to the morality of the 1950s, dismissed her as a substance use and a whore who got what she deserved. It was as if the trial of 1958 was being relitigated in the court of public opinion, proving that the scars of the culture war she sparked had never truly healed. In the wake of her death, a scramble began for her papers. Rumors had persisted for decades that Candy Barr had written a memoir, or that she possessed a stash of letters from Mickey Cohen, or perhaps even evidence regarding the Dallas underworld of 1963. Collectors and historians salivated at the thought. If she had kept a diary, it could rewrite the history of organized crime in America. It could shed light on the corruption of the Dallas Police Department. It could perhaps settle the Jack Ruby debate once and for all. But Juanita, ever the survivor, had covered her tracks. If such a memoir existed, it was never found. Her estate was modest. There were no smoking guns hidden in the attic. There were mostly personal items. Photos of her daughter, letters from friends, and her poems. The absence of a tell-all book was her final act of defiance. She refused to sell out the people she had loved, even the ones who had hurt her, and she refused to give the public the satisfaction of consuming her inner thoughts. She took her secrets to the grave, leaving the historians to speculate and the conspiracy theorists to spin their webs. There was also the tragedy of the lost biopics. For years, Hollywood had circled her story. In the early 80s, there was serious talk of a film starring Farrah Fawcett as Candy Barr. It would have been a massive production, but it never happened. Scripts were written and discarded. Studios were afraid of the legal implications, or simply couldn't figure out how to tell the story of a woman who is both an icon of desire and a victim without alienating audiences. So, when she died, there was no definitive movie to reference. There was only the legend, hazy and distorted by time. In the weeks and months after the funeral, the dust settled in Victoria, Texas. The reporters went home. The internet moved on to the next scandal. But the ghost of Candy Barr lingered. Her death marked the end of an era. She was one of the last living links to the Noir age of Texas, that specific window of time between World War II and the Kennedy assassination, when the lines between the law and the lawless were blurred beyond recognition. With her gone, the reality of her life began to be replaced entirely by the symbol. She became a stencil art image on hipster t-shirts. She became the subject of indie rock songs. She became a vibe on Tumblr and Pinterest, vintage glamour, danger, and coolness. But this commodification erased the pain. The young women who posted photos of Candy Barr on their mood boards saw the pearl-handled gun and the confident smile. But they didn't see the 15-year prison sentence. They didn't see the abuse. They didn't see the lonely death in a hospital room. Juanita Dale Slusher's life had ended, but Candy Barr's myth was just being born. To the jurors of 1958, she was a problem to be solved, a stain to be scrubbed from the fabric of society. But history has a way of overruling the verdicts of small men. When we wipe away the gossip and the glitter, what remains is not a criminal record, but a mirror reflecting the darkest anxieties of the American century. The 15-year sentence handed down to her was never about marijuana. It was a judicial kidnapping. It was a message carved into the life of a young woman by a system terrified of female autonomy. In an era when rapists walked free on probation and wife-beaters were given a slap on the wrist, Candy Barr was sacrificed on the altar of public morality. Her crime wasn't possessing a plant. Her crime was possessing herself. She was guilty of being uncontrolled in a world that demanded women be obedient. Decades later, she has become a battlefield for meaning. To the second-wave feminists, she was a victim of the male gaze. To the modern generation, she is a pioneer of radical agency, the mother of the OnlyFans economy who monetized her own image before the world was ready to accept it. She walked so that the era of liberation could run, but she was crushed by the very tanks she stood in front of. Her ghost now dances in every neo-burlesque club from London to Tokyo. Every performer who straps on a holster and challenges the audience with a defiant stare is borrowing a piece of Candy's fire. She was inducted into the Hall of Fame, celebrated by the likes of Dita Von Teese, and immortalized as the archetype of the gangster's girl. But unlike the modern stars who play at danger, Candy lived it. She didn't wear a costume, she wore a scar. And yet, the tragedy persists. The price of her immortality was paid in the currency of her humanity. The state didn't just lock away a dancer, they destroyed a mother, severing the bond with her daughter and leaving a trail of generational trauma that no posthumous applause can heal. So, how does the story truly end? It ends with a final delicious irony. The men who hunted her, Judge Joe B. Brown, District Attorney Henry Wade, the hypocritical jurors, are now nothing more than dust in the archives, remembered only for their cruelty. Their moral outrage has faded into silence. But Candy Barr, she is still here. She is in the defiant smile of every woman who refuses to be shamed. She is in the grit of every outsider fighting to survive in a hostile city. She is the eternal Texas rose, growing through the cracks in the concrete, thorny, wild, and impossible to kill. They locked her up to make the world forget her, but in doing so, they ensured that we would remember her forever. The lights of the Colony Club have long since burned out, and the white Cadillac has rusted to dust. But in the smoky haze of history, the girl in the cowboy hat is still dancing, and this time, nobody can tell her to stop.